witnesses for being here today. This hearing, entitled An International Response to Ortega's Destruction of Democracy in Nicaragua, will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, strenuous materials, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something into the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact subcommittee staff. As a reminder to members joining remotely, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish speaking. Consistent with Res 8 and the accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum, and I now recognize myself for opening remarks. Over the last 4 months, the Ortega regime has carried out a shameless campaign to eliminate the political opposition and consolidate a one-party dictatorship in Nicaragua. Even at a time when many governments in Latin America are dismantling democratic institutions, the Ortega regime's crackdown stands out for how brazen and sweeping it has been. The regime has rounded up nearly every potential challenger to Ortega and has not even tried to hide these arrests and forced disappearances under a veneer of legality. The message from Daniel Ortega is clear. He believes he will lose November's election if they are competitive. Over 150 political prisoners are now being held in Nicaragua jails. Many of them were forcibly disappeared. And earlier this month, some family members were finally able to visit these prisoners for the first time since their arrest in June. They reported deplorable conditions and evidence of torture, solitary confinement, and starvation. Some prisoners have lost more than 20 pounds since they were detained. Today, I reiterate the long-standing call for the immediate release of all political prisoners in Nicaragua. I applaud the Biden administration for its recent sanction against 100 regime officials and 50 family members for their acts of corruption and violations of human rights. The administration has been consistent in condemning the Ortega regime's action and has worked to promote a more multilateral approach to Nicaragua. The passage of a resolution in June by the Organization of the American States was a small but positive step forward because it gained the support of additional member states that had previously abstained on issues related to Nicaragua. But much more must be done. Having written the NICA Act with Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, I am frustrated that the International Monetary Fund recently provided $350 million to the regime. The IMF should not take Ortega's word for it that these funds will be used to address the COVID pandemic. We must all remember that this is the same regime that spent first 16 months of the pandemic holding large political rallies, manipulating medical records to deflate the death toll, and firing doctors and nurses who dared to speak. International financial institutions should not be providing a lifeline to Ortega. The House of Representatives must urgently pass the Renacer Act, which would strengthen oversight of funds provided by international financial institutions and increase targeted sanctions against regime officials. This legislation will encourage the U.S. to continue working more closely with the European Union and implement a sanction framework. We should also begin preparing a number of severe diplomatic consequences, assuming Nicaragua's election in November become a coronation for Ortega. Nicaragua should be suspended under the International Democratic Charter on November 8th, and its participation under the Central American Free Trade Agreement should be reconsidered. Nicaraguan activists Opposition leaders, journalists, students, and doctors have shown tremendous courage in the face of the Ortega regime's violation of their most basic rights. We must show that we stand with them in this battle against a brutally repressive dictatorship. Thank you, and I now turn to the ranking member, Mark Green, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sears, for convening this hearing and bringing attention to the dire situation in Nicaragua. And I want to thank the Deputy Assistant Secretary for being here in person. Really appreciate that. With the hope of discussing the policy options that are before the United States. I also want to thank the witnesses on our second panel, Ms. Valle, Ms. Chinchilla, former president of Costa Rica, and Ryan Berg. I'm deeply saddened and appalled by the repression that is taking place in Nicaragua. There is no question that the Ortega regime has turned Nicaragua into a tyrannical police state. I and the committee regularly meet with the wives, the relatives, and loved ones of Ortega's political prisoners and victims. Their stories are heartbreaking, including, of course, Ms. Valle's. Her husband, Felix, has been a political prisoner for over 100 days. This is unacceptable. The widespread repression is especially terrifying as victims have no idea if they're on the government's watch list. You can just have the thought that you might run for president and wind up in jail. That's insane. Some people are detained for challenging the dictatorship, others for daring to think or believe differently than the socialist leader. Right now, over 150 innocent Nicaraguans are held as political prisoners, many of them kept in inhumane conditions and deprived of due process. There are many credible reports of starvation as well as psychological and physical torture. For instance, there's opposition student leader Lester Elman, a 23-year-old. I met his sister this morning. A 23-year-old who can't even walk due to the brutality he's enduring while illegally detained. Or Francisco Aguirre Sacasa, I think I'm saying that correctly, a 77-year-old whose family the committee met with last week. His health is poor, yet the regime is withholding critical medication from him. Stories of mistreatment and acts of torture have become far too common in Ortega's Nicaragua. While I appreciate the administration's targeted sanctions and visa revocations against regime officials, the situation in Nicaragua is continuing to deteriorate. And frankly, I'm appalled that just last Thursday, the U.S. Commercial Service sent an email promoting business opportunities in Ortega's Nicaragua. President Biden needs better coordination of policy and messaging. Clearly, Ortega is not taking the Biden administration seriously, and time is of the essence. On November 7th, a political farce will be held claiming to resemble elections. No one should be fooled about the outcome. Any hope of unseating the socialist dictatorship is sitting inside of Ortega's prisons. The United States must condemn this charade and urge our international partners to join us. More should and can be done. To start, the House must pass the bipartisan Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to Conditions for Electoral Reform, also known as the Renacer Act. I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill, which unanimously passed the Senate and the House Foreign Affairs Committee this summer. Congress must support the Nicaraguan people and respond to Ortega's repressive crackdown. I urge Speaker Pelosi to immediately schedule this bill for a vote. We are running out of time. Passing this act will send the Ortega regime a clear message that its violent and repressive behavior has severe consequences and that America is watching. Beyond passing the act, the Biden administration must fully enforce laws that are already in place, like the Nicaraguan Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act, also known as NICA. Despite NICA placing strict conditions on loans and assistance from international financial institutions, Daniel Ortega and his regime officials have benefited greatly from international financing, which my esteemed chairman and colleague has just talked about with the loans, the $400 million, unconscionable and unbelievable. The Biden administration must ensure that investment conditions are fully implemented to the letter of the law International financing must not benefit a despotic socialist regime that continues to commit egregious human rights violations. I look forward to hearing more about how the administration plans to address these key challenges and the situations in Nicaragua. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Green. I will now introduce our first panel. Ms. Emily Mendrala serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary covering Central America in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State. She was the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy in the Americas, promoting U.S. policies of engagement towards the Americas from 2017 to 2021. Ms. Mendrala prior government service includes serving as Director of Legislative Affairs in the National Security Council, a special advisor in the Department of State, and a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ms. Mendrala, we welcome you to the hearing. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Mendrala, you are recognized for your testimony.
Chairman Series, Ranking Member Green, distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you today as President Biden's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State. I look forward to talking with you today about U.S. policy responses to the increasingly authoritarian steps being taken by the Ortega Murillo government in Nicaragua. As you are well aware, the Ortega Murillo government has carried out a ruthless crackdown over the past several months, canceling the registration of opposition parties, incarcerating journalists, opposition leaders, potential presidential candidates, students, private sector leaders, and others who defend free and fair elections, attacking the free press, closing long-standing NGOs that provide humanitarian and medical assistance to Nicaraguans in need. While we had hoped that the government would respond to the voices of the Nicaraguan people themselves and U.S. and international urging to abide by its commitments, we have seen instead an acceleration of Ortega and Murillo's efforts to consolidate their own power. As Secretary Blinken stated on August 7th, quote, "The United States views the regime's latest undemocratic authoritarian actions driven by Ortega's fear of an electoral loss as the final blow against Nicaragua's prospects for a free and fair election later this year. That electoral process, including its eventual results, has lost all credibility," end quote. In the face of sham elections in Nicaragua, we and our international partners must continue to denounce and push back against the Ortega Murillo government's anti-democratic rule, as well as its use of Russian-inspired laws to carry out repression. We must demonstrate that these practices have no place in our hemisphere. We have called repeatedly on the Nicaraguan government to release all political prisoners immediately. We hold President Ortega and Vice President Murillo and those who carry out their authoritarian orders responsible for the detainees' safety and well-being. Every day in August, we highlighted on social media the personal profile of one of the recently detained Nicaraguan political prisoners, drawing widespread media coverage in Nicaragua and in international press to their cases and spotlighting the regime's repressive tactics. These individuals have taken enormous risks and made enormous sacrifices in their efforts to demand genuine democracy in Nicaragua, and none deserves the mistreatment and injustice they are now suffering. The department has taken strong actions already to impose consequences on the Ortega Murillo government. We have worked with the Treasury Department to impose sanctions on those implicated in carrying out the government's crackdown. As of September 14th, 2021, the United States has sanctioned 31 individuals and 8 entities under our Nicaragua and Global Magnitsky sanctions programs, and the department has applied visa restrictions to 169 Nicaraguans in response to the political crackdown and the application of sham laws that ensure the November election will not be free, fair, transparent, or reflective of the will of the Nicaraguan people. We are working with the international community, urging our neighbors and partners in the region and beyond to join us in multilateral fora to send a clear signal to the Ortega Murillo government that democracies in the hemisphere will reject these repressive actions. Following advocacy by the United States and our partners, the OAS issued a strong resolution on June 15th, backed by an overwhelming majority of 26 member states, which condemned the Ortega Murillo government's arrests and called for the immediate release of political prisoners. At the UN Human Rights Council, we were pleased to be one of 59 governments that called for the release of prisoners on June 22nd. We are also working closely with the EU, Canada, and the UK to coordinate additional targeted measures. We were pleased that Canada announced on July 14th targeted sanctions on 15 Nicaraguan individuals, and we welcomed the EU's August 2nd announcement of sanctions on 8 Nicaraguan individuals, including Vice President Murillo. These joint actions have further isolated the Ortega Murillo government. Through USAID, we continue to support Nicaraguan civil society, independent media, and human rights defenders. Our continued support assures Nicaraguans that the outside world has not forgotten them. In conclusion, the Department of State stands firmly with the Nicaraguan people and their desire for genuine democracy, and we will continue to pursue bold actions in response to the Nicaraguan government's failure to uphold fundamental freedoms and respect for human rights. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you for your statement. And we will now go to questions. The NICA Act of 2018, which I wrote with Congresswoman Ileana Rose-Layton, was intended to restrict Nicaragua's access to loans from international financial institutions, except for funds to address basic human needs. But the Ortega regime has received more than $400 million in recent months from the World Bank and IDB. I guess my question to you is, are we using our voice? Is the administration using its voice and vote with the international financial institution to oppose loans and other financial assistance to Ortega? Because I have to tell you, it's very upsetting to me that we do all this work here, we ask the administration to put sanctions on different people, and yet the IMF, which we probably contribute the largest amount of money, or if not one of the largest amount of money, they seem to just ignore what's going on in Nicaragua. And it really is. I intend to write a letter to the IMF, and hopefully we'll have it before this committee, because this is not acceptable. I mean, I don't know if there's any transparency with the money that they get. I don't know what they use it for. I don't know if the IMF knows what they use it for. But there are clear signs that this regime is not interested in going by the law. So my question to you is, are we paying attention to what's going on with IMF and the loans to Nicaragua?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. Yes is the answer. We are using our voice and our vote in every opportunity in front of multilateral institutions to oppose lending to the Ortega Murillo government. We will continue to use our voice, vote, and influence to advocate against lending from international financial institutions to the Ortega Murillo government, and we will also continue to collaborate with international partners where appropriate, EU, Canada, and others to do the same.
But how is it that they get such a large loan?
The specifics of the IMF loan, as I understand it, was an expansion of special drawing rights. It was a global expansion. And I can assure you that when given the opportunity, the U.S. is using its voice and vote to oppose.
Well, you know, earlier this year, I introduced the Renacer Act, which passed unanimously out of committee. The bill requires targeted sanctions coordinated with the international community to advance elections in November. I also will expand oversight of loans from international institutions. Will passing this legislation provide the Biden administration with additional tools to address the political crisis in Nicaragua? I mean, if we pass this act, is it going to help you, or is it going to be the same old status quo?
First of all, I want to thank you for the partnership that you and others on this committee have demonstrated and collaboration in addressing the authoritarian trends that we're seeing in Nicaragua. We are familiar with the Renacer Act. We welcome the bipartisanship. We welcome all constructive efforts to hold the Ortega Murillo government accountable. And we are committed to continuing to, as we just discussed in the last question, use our voice, vote, and influence to advocate against lending in international financial institutions. And we look forward to continuing to work with you, and especially if the Renacer Act is passed in this chamber, to continue to use the tools that Congress has given us to hold the Ortega Murillo government accountable.
Do you have any recommendations for us that we could continue to put more pressure on this government to make sure that, you know, there are free, fair elections and doesn't treat its people like it's treating? Do you have any recommendation that we can do here in Congress that you can support, so we can support democratic aspirations in Nicaragua?
Thank you for that question. One of the most important measures over the last several months has been an OAS resolution that passed in June with 26 member states supporting it, that called to account the Ortega Murillo government for actions that were happening in Nicaragua. Through U.S. leadership, we were able to secure a very important coalition of 26 member states. The resolution that was adopted stated that the measures adopted by the government of Nicaragua do not meet the conditions for transparent, free, and fair elections to which all member states have committed under the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which calls into question the legitimacy of the November elections. This was an important move. It was very important for the OAS to put forward a clear and credible and strong response to the actions that we were seeing. And we continue to work with governments throughout the region, through the OAS and otherwise, to continue those strong statements and measures of accountability, and we welcome Congress's partnership.
My time is almost up, but I just will urge you and the department to really put more pressure on the IMF that this is just not acceptable, that they get all this money and God knows how they use it or where it goes. Thank you. Ranking Member Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Madrela, last week, well, let me start by saying this. Today, you've mentioned the Ortega regime or government, and I would encourage you to say the Ortega regime, because I'm not sure that it's really legitimate. In fact, I think it's not. I'm convinced it's not a legitimate government that was duly elected. I think the last several elections since he's been in control have been manipulated, and therefore I would recommend calling him a regime. And so why is that important? Because consistency in words and what we say matter. I'll give you an example. Last week, the U.S. Commercial Service sent an email to U.S. private sector partners highlighting business opportunities in Central America, including those within Nicaragua. It said, quote, "Perhaps most importantly, Nicaragua has a highly organized and sophisticated private sector committed to a free economy that can fully leverage these resources if supported by a responsible government," end quote. Yet the State Department's 2021 Investment Climate Report says, quote, "Investors should be extremely cautious about investing in Nicaragua under President Daniel Ortega's authoritarian government," end quote. These inconsistencies create problems. Maybe that's why the IMF made its bad decision. And your thoughts about these inconsistencies and the importance of the Biden administration saying one thing and sticking to it.
Thank you, Ranking Member Green, for the question. And thank you also for noting the climate that has been created in Nicaragua for private sector investment. It's something that we are paying attention to in the context of Central America writ large. The administration is committed to a new comprehensive approach to address regional migration, as I know you are all aware. And one of the key elements to that approach are targeted efforts to address root causes, to combat the root causes of migration throughout Central America. And there has been a key focus on anti-corruption.
If I could just interrupt, though, I meant us to go a little different direction. I'm talking about messaging and saying a consistent theme, right? So one of the things when we sent the nearshoring bill to your department, very good dialogue happened, and they said, we need a quiver. We need an arrow in our quiver to be able to leverage these, dictators, folks like Nicaragua, to say, look, if you're not acting like this and you act like this, there's a chance you could qualify for some. So the consistency is what I'm asking you to, comment on, and what are y'all doing to fix these obvious contrasts?
Absolutely. We are committed to consistency. Thank you for bringing some of those cases to our attention. And they are already on our radar. There is a robust interagency discussion on Nicaragua. This is a top priority and a chief concern of the administration. The systematic erosion, dismantling of democratic norms and cultures in Nicaragua. And it is something that has the attention at the highest levels, and we are committed to consistency, to continuing to call to account the anti-democratic actions that we're seeing, and support the Nicaraguan people.
I think that's good. Just make sure you guys are calling to account when somebody in your administration sends a message like this email that went out, hey, think about investing in Nicaragua. Changing the subject a little bit, migration issues, you sort of mentioned that, so let's go there. 100,000 Nicaraguans now in Costa Rica. What's the impact on Costa Rica, and how do we address that and help the Costa Ricans address that?
Thank you. I was in Costa Rica in early June at a regional migration conference, and it was clear that there are large flows of Nicaraguans arriving to Costa Rica. This has been the case not just in 2021. It also occurred in the wake of the 2018
Right.
political crackdowns in Nicaragua as well. Costa Rica is a very important partner for us in the region, especially on the topic of regional migration. We are committed to work with them. There are several programs through the Department of State, through our Bureau of Populations, Refugees, and Migration that are working in close partnership with international organizations and the Costa Rican government to address these challenges. It's a concern. And if I may, to finish my thought on on anti-corruption and why it is such a chief focus of ours, I think you could have seen a scenario, and we did in many respects see a scenario 5-6 years ago, where some may have given the Nicaraguan government a pass. They said there's relative security and it's a relatively stable investment climate. But we see now that would have been a very bad bet because of the anti-democratic actions. And it's reason why anti-corruption is such an important underpinning for all of our work in Central America, because we have to have that foundation in order to see the efforts to address root causes really prosper.
And you're making my point, if I can, Mr. Chairman, very quickly about the need for consistency from
Absolutely.
the administration. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. We will now hear from Member Joaquin Castro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you for organizing this hearing today. I want to take this opportunity to express my support for the thousands who have been the victims of Ortega's brutal crackdown on human rights. In the last few months, he's broken vital norms and institutions of democratic practice, and the upcoming November 7th elections will be neither free nor fair. I think it's necessary that the United States stands up to this threat to freedom in the region and stands behind those fighting to bring democracy back to Nicaragua. Since June, the Ortega regime has arrested dozens of political opposition, civil society, and business leaders, including Cristiana Chamorro and Ambassador Aguirre Sacasa. Some have been forcibly disappeared for weeks without their families being notified of their whereabouts, while others have been forced to flee the country for fear of imprisonment and torture. So my first question is, what is the U.S. government doing to push for the safe release of these political prisoners?
Thank you, Representative Castro, for the question. We share your concerns, and we share the concerns of so many that have watched this repression take place and followed the grave humanitarian situation of many of those who are unjustly detained in Nicaragua right now. We are speaking out in strong terms in condemnation of these political arrests. We are expressing concern at the fact that some of the prisoners are being held incommunicado without the medicine that they need. We have called for access to the political prisoners by their family members and legal representatives, as well as for needed medication. We launched a social media campaign in August that highlighted the plight of Nicaraguan political prisoners and their families, that garnered media attention in Nicaragua and throughout the international press. And more broadly, we're using the diplomatic and economic tools at our disposal to promote accountability for President Ortega, Vice President Murillo, and other actors in Nicaragua who are complicit in this wave of repression.
Well, with every political opponent either imprisoned or forced to flee, the signs point to Ortega being elected for a fourth term on November 7th. Should this election continue to occur under unjust and repressive measures, how will the administration change its engagement with and public stance on Nicaragua?
Thank you for that question. We have long urged Nicaragua to listen to the Nicaraguan people, abide by its commitments to implement electoral reforms, and allow free and fair elections. And it is clear that the Ortega-Murillo government took steps to consolidate its own power instead. We have already noted through Secretary Blinken's statements that the United States views the regime's latest undemocratic authoritarian actions as the final blow against the prospects for free and fair elections later this year. The electoral process has lost all credibility. We will continue to work through the OAS, work with our partners in international fora, and we will continue to review the U.S. relationship with the Ortega-Murillo government following those elections.
No, well, thank you. And I have one final question on this very important issue of political prisoners and democracy there. You mentioned the multilateral institutions and partners. Have we seen any particular nations step up to be helpful in putting pressure on Nicaragua to release these political prisoners? Who has stepped up?
Absolutely. We have had great partnership through the OAS, as I noted. 26 member states joined together in a very important coalition to condemn abuses and stand with the political prisoners demanding their release. We have also seen Canada and the EU in particular take actions, targeted sanctions against Nicaraguan individuals in response to actions, and these are actions that we assess have further isolated the Ortega-Murillo regime, and I would draw attention to Canada and EU's efforts in particular.
No, thank you. And then I'll just ask one final question, and you'll probably have to take it for the record because I'm running out of time. But how, if at all, does Nicaragua fit within the administration's strategy to address root causes of migration from Central America? And how does the administration plan to engage with Nicaragua on root cause issues, given obviously the repression of democracy and human rights? And I'll submit that question for the record. But thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Wonderful to see you again, Emily Mandrella, and I want to thank you because you always took my phone calls when I was begging you to give visas to 2 sick children, Luis Orlando Rodriguez and Hector Trujillo. So I'm indebted to you for that. But I also need to tell you that I am very embarrassed. I am very upset. And because the United States is not present in this hemisphere, period. You know, I represent Miami, the heart of the Cuban exile community and the heart of the Nicaraguan community. And when you tell me that you are working through social media to denounce the Ortega administration, I'm only full of anger because of the people that I represent. It burns like acid on our skin, and I just want to share that with you. Where is the Biden administration? I just have 3 names here that I want to share with you. Maybe people do not recognize who this guy is. This is Arturo Cruz, who was ambassador for Ortega to Washington. He is in jail. He's lost 30 pounds. This guy, Felix Maradiaga, has been tortured, psychologically tortured. And here we have Chamorro, who we do not know what's really happening with him. So not only we have abandoned these people, the Biden administration has abandoned these people, but like my colleague said, no, we're helping them. In August, the IMF gave $353 million to the repressive apparatus. Did you know about that loan? $353 million to Ortega last month? Did the State Department know about this? Just yes or no?
We have used our voice, vote, and influence in international financial institutions.
No. I'm asking you, did you guys know, did you guys call the United States representative in the IMF? We give $100 billion to the IMF. Did you guys call the IMF and said, no, we cannot do that? Did you do that, yes or no?
We oppose lending through international financial institutions.
So that means that the
Nicaragua
executive director did not pay attention to what the State Department was telling them not to give a loan to Ortega for $353 million.
Ma'am, I can tell you that in every instance we have opposed lending.
So that means that our own representative is not paying attention to the State Department.
No, ma'am, I can tell you that we have opposed in international
But it still happened.
institutions.
We opposed it, but they received it, and what do you think they're going to give that money to? Just to put these people in jail and torture them even more. And not only that, I just want to share with you something else that's happening. In January of next year, the Commerce Department next year is putting together an event that says that Nicaragua is committed to transparency and the rule of law. Our Commerce Department, did you know about that?
We have, through the interagency process, spoken with all of our interagency
I'm just asking you if you knew about
the
this
challenges
event
in Nicaragua.
specifically. There is one event from the Commerce Department saying that Nicaragua is committed to transparency. Did the State Department know about that?
It's been brought to my attention, yes, ma'am.
It was, so then what did you say? Yeah, let's promote Nicaragua.
No, in
No?
fact, that's not the case.
So what did you say?
Gravely concerned about anti-democratic actions in Nicaragua, and we have made that known throughout.
I know you're concerned, but I'm asking you if the State Department can make sure that the Commerce Department does not hold that event in favor of Nicaragua.
We are absolutely committed to working with the Commerce Department to register our concerns.
Register your concerns means that it may happen, it may not. And what like Representative Sears just said, we passed a law called Renacer. The Senate passed this law, and Speaker Pelosi is not willing to bring it to the floor. You have nothing to do with that, but I am sure that the Biden administration could help and call Mrs. Pelosi and say, we would like to see Renacer on the floor. Now, let me just see if I have one more minute, and if I can get a little bit more time. Cuba. We have had many discussions about Cuba. I always ask you about connectivity. My question is, how many companies on the private sector have you called to ask for due diligence for connectivity for Cuba? How many companies?
We have spoken with several. I can't give you a number off the top of my head, but we are having regular convenings with private sector actors to promote efforts.
I'm not saying about promoting, I'm saying asking for due diligence to figure out who can provide internet to Cuba. How many?
It's a
3, 5, 6, how many?
It's a chief concern of ours. And
No, I'm not saying it's a chief concern. I'm asking how many people have you asked to do due diligence for connectivity for Cuba?
We have spoken with several private sector actors.
When are they going to give you a response?
Many of them are already engaging through several different means.
But you've always told me that it's not that easy. I did my due diligence. I have one company. Have you communicated with them, the one who is most advanced?
We have spoken with several companies, yes, ma'am. And I believe I know the company to which you're referencing, and we have had conversations with them.
All right. So you think that by next month, can you commit that by next month you can give the members of Congress a report on what's happening with the due diligence for connectivity for Cuba?
We would be happy to brief, yes.
So that means that I have your word on the record that by next month you're going to give the members of Congress a report on what's happening with that.
We would be happy to brief.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We now recognize Andy Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And it's so upsetting where things have come to in Nicaragua. I remember when the Somoza dictatorship fell in 1979, and there was hopes there were hopes for democracy, and today the level of repression and the number of people thrown in prison is just very, very upsetting. So, Ms. Mandrala, the Biden administration requested a total of $15 million for the fiscal year 2022 for assistance to Nicaragua, all of which was supposed to be for democracy, rights, and governance programs. Explain what we've been doing with our democracy assistance in terms of pushing back against Ortega's repression and what could be done better.
Thank you, Representative Levitt, for the question. We are, through USAID, supporting Nicaraguan civil society, independent media, and human rights defenders as they fight for a return to democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. It is a tough operating environment, as you can imagine, and our support assures Nicaraguans that the outside world has not forgotten them.
So basically, we're helping to fund organizations that are under attack and whose leaders may be being put in jail and this kind of thing. And we're just kind of doing our best to keep them afloat. Is that what we're doing?
There are several organizations in Nicaragua, in civil society, and independent media that are doing great work. They are taking great risks as well to promote democracy, anti-corruption, bringing information to the world about what is happening in Nicaragua. And some of our democracy promotion assistance comes alongside these organizations to support their work. It is as I said, a very difficult operating environment, especially over the last few months, as we have seen systematic repression and imprisonment of several of the champions for democracy in civil society, opposition leaders, journalists, private sector leaders, and others. And
all right, I just have a couple more minutes, so let me just ask you, if you can share with my office, kind of information about that. I look forward to reviewing it, and but I also want to talk to you about the humanitarian situation. You've mentioned it. It's a real crisis. There have been 2 hurricanes in November of last year, the COVID-19 pandemic. My understanding is only 2.5% of Nicaraguans have been fully vaccinated, and at least a third of the country is living in poverty. There are high rates of malnutrition, as there have been for years. Can you describe what our U.S. support is for Nicaragua to respond to the hurricanes and the pandemic, or for Nicaraguan people to? And how are we seeking to address the current humanitarian crisis in Nicaragua?
Thank you very much for that question. I will note that Nicaragua is the second poorest country in the hemisphere. Their economy contracted 3.9% in 2019 and 3% in 2020. We are very concerned about the humanitarian situation on the island in the wake of the hurricanes, as you mentioned, and also because of the mismanagement of the pandemic in the country and its dire impacts. With respect to vaccines, in early June, President Biden announced that the United States will donate 500 million Pfizer vaccines to 92 low and middle income countries and the African Union. It was a historic action that will help supercharge the global fight against the pandemic. Nicaragua is one of the countries receiving vaccines under the COVAX mechanism, and it's eligible to receive this donation. It's another example of support for the Nicaraguan people. While
how many vaccines have we donated, and how many have been actually distributed? You called Nicaragua an island a minute ago. I think you're referring to the poorest country in the hemisphere, Haiti, where distribution is a huge problem, and a very small percentage of the 500,000 doses that we sent there have been distributed. What's the situation in Nicaragua as my time expires?
Thank you for that question. I'm happy to get back to you with specifics about vaccine distribution. To my knowledge, the vaccines have not yet been distributed, but Nicaragua is eligible to receive the donation that the United States made to COVAX.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Levin. Now we recognize Representative Juan Vargas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity, and I in particular want to thank the witness here today. I would, at the outset, note that in the Renacer bill, we actually call the Ortega government the Ortega government. So we should be consistent ourselves. If we want to call them the Ortega regime, we should call them the Ortega regime. But anyway, so the only reason I say that is because I think Deputy Assistant Secretary Emily Medrada is just simply following what we wrote. I'm also on that bill. I am very disappointed with what has happened in Nicaragua. I was a young Jesuit missionary back in 1986, and I went to Nicaragua, and I was there at the UCA, the Universidad Centroamérica, and stayed for 2 weeks on my way to El Salvador, where I was then stationed for a much longer period of time. And Nicaragua was very poor. Obviously, it was coming out of what had happened with Somoza. And the tragedy is it seems to be exactly the same again. I mean, you have a dictator there, and this dictator is enriching himself and impoverishing his people. He's once again, just like Somoza, using incredible repression, violence against his own people. I do want to ask you specifically, if I could, Ms. Mandrala, about the university there. The rector of the university is a priest by the name of Chepe Iliaquez. I had received information from the Jesuits of Central America that his life was in danger a number of times. That he was out there protesting and helping some of these students who were being shot, and he was bringing them to the rectory and bringing them to the university. Could you give me more information on that?
Thank you very much, Representative. We share your concerns and the devastation for events in Nicaragua, for anti-democratic actions, and the impacts on the people. I think it's really important that we keep centered the human aspect of this, the consequences that Nicaraguan people are facing. On the specific case of the university there, I am familiar with the university, but not the specific security concerns of the rector. I would be happy to follow up with you after this hearing to get additional information, provide information that we know through our embassy, and also discuss ways that we can be helpful.
Well, I'm very concerned about it, just to be frank. I was in El Salvador after Nicaragua, and of course they killed a lot of the Jesuit priests there. They were able to go into the rectory. The name of the university is the same. It's Universidad Centroamérica, although it also has an addition, Simón Cañas, in El Salvador as opposed to Nicaragua. And I'm very concerned because the university and this rector have spoken out about the evils of this regime, and in doing so, I think has put themselves in harm's way, and we certainly need to do all we can to help them. And again, I do look forward to that briefing from you. I'm very, very concerned about Chepe and the university there. Lastly, I do want to ask, I mean, it does seem to me rather odd that with all the repression, torture, the murder, the disappearance, that we're giving these guys money through the IMF. That just doesn't make sense. I mean, this money wasn't going specifically towards the pandemic, was it? I mean, it seems like they were using it for other items and other purposes.
Thank you for the question. As I understand it, this was an expansion of special drawing rights, and it was a global expansion. And as I've noted, we take very seriously our responsibility, and we are at every opportunity using our voice, vote, and influence to advocate against lending through international or financial institutions to the Ortega Murillo government. We'll continue to do so, and we have taken note of strong congressional opposition to the recent IMF loan, and we will certainly, through our good offices at the State Department, make those concerns known.
Ms. Mandrala, do we have the ability to veto a drawdown like that from them? as the
Sir, I
largest,
do not know the answer to that off the top of my head. My suspicion is no, but I'll take that back and get back to you.
Thank you very much, and I really do appreciate you being here, and I'll look forward to getting back to you about the university. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Vargas. Well, thank you, Ms. Ventrala, for your testimony, for answering the questions. I look forward to working with you in the coming weeks and months to do everything we can to support the democratic aspirations of the Nicaraguan people. But we will be following up on this issue of the loans from the IMF because it's really not fair to the people of Nicaragua. It was supposed to go to vaccines. You know, obviously you're telling me that you don't know much of any type of programs to vaccinate the people of Nicaragua. So where's the money going to? So I thank you for being here, and I will recess for a few minutes for the second panel to take their seats. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry, you want to say anything?
No.
All right, the subcommittee will come to order. I will now introduce our second panel. Ms. Berta Valle is a prominent Nicaraguan journalist and human rights defender. She is also the wife of Felix Maradiaga, a leading civil society and opposition political figure who was arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared by the Ortega regime. In her 15 years of experience as an activist, Ms. Valle has focused on issues of children's rights, social issues, and human rights. During her forced exile from Nicaragua, she has worked to raise awareness about the human rights situation in Nicaragua and what is happening to Felix and other political prisoners. Ms. Valle, we welcome you to the hearing. We will then hear from President Laura Chinchilla. She was elected the first female president of the Republic of Costa Rica in 2010. President Chinchilla previously served as Minister of Public Security, President of the National Immigration Board, and the National Drug Council, and as a member of Congress. She currently serves as Vice President of the Club de Madrid and co-chair of the Board of Directors at the Inter-American Dialogue. President Chinchilla graduated from the University of Costa Rica and holds a master's in public policy from Georgetown University. President Chinchilla, we thank you for joining us today. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Ryan Berg, Senior Fellow in the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Dr. Berg was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he helped lead its Latin American Studies program. His research focuses on U.S.-Latin American relations, authoritarian regimes, and armed conflict, strategic competition, and trade and development issues. Dr. Berg obtained a bachelor's degree in government and theology from Georgetown University and a doctorate in political science from the University of Oxford. Dr. Berg, thank you for joining us today. I ask the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. And without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Valle, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Cires, Ranking Member Green, distinguished member of this committee. It is an honor to appear before you today. Thank you for the space to discuss the ongoing crisis of democracy and human rights in Nicaragua, and for your continual concern for the Nicaraguan people. My name is Berta Valle, and I am the wife of Felix Maradiaga. Felix is a human rights defender, academic, and candidate for president of Nicaragua. For 105 days, he has been a political prisoner of the regime of Daniel Ortega, simply for speaking out against the human rights violation of the regime. Felix is just one of the more than 140 political prisoners held in Nicaragua. My husband, Felix Maradiaga, has devoted his life to Nicaragua and its people. As a young boy, he flew Nicaragua because of war and lived in the United States as a refugee. He returned as an adolescent, committed to building a peaceful and prosperous country for all Nicaraguans. As a teacher, public servant, and activist, he was always emphasizing the importance of nonviolent change, peaceful resistance, and civilian democracy. But this work has made him an enemy of Daniel Ortega. Indeed, for years, Felix had been speaking out in Nicaragua and abroad that Daniel Ortega posed a severe threat to our democracy. We have seen him consolidate his power and abuse of human rights. Now we are living the nightmare my husband warned about many years ago, including before this same subcommittee in 2019. On June 8th of this year, Felix was called to the public ministry for an interview. While there, he was interrogated for 4 hours. He left the public ministry and 15 meters away away from the press, his car was pulled over by the police. He was pulled out of the car and beaten and taken away. On the same day, Juan Sebastián Chamorro, another presidential candidate, was also taken from his home. The regime has used the same tactics. Again, countless of opposition leaders, including presidential candidates, party leaders, student activists, journalists, business people, labor leaders, and peasants. For 84 days, Felix and Juan Sebastián were disappeared. They were held in an enclosed location without any access to their families, their lawyers, or their doctors. For 84 days, we didn't even know if their or the other disappeared people were alive. Since June 8, Juan Sebastián's wife, Victoria Cárdenas, and I have been raising our voices and speaking out about the situation of political prisoners in Nicaragua. We know that if we remain silent, Daniel Ortega will win. In July, Victoria and I traveled here to Washington to meet with officials in the Biden administration, with members of Congress, including Chairman Sears and Ranking Member Green, with civil society groups and human rights organizations. Days later, the Ortega regime convicted us, traitors of the homeland, just for speaking with a US government official and advocating for the release of Felix, Juan Sebastián, and the rest of the political prisoners. On August 31st, after 84 days of being disappeared, the regime allowed Felix, Juan Sebastián, and some other prisoners a short visit with a family member. This was the first time that anyone has seen or heard from them since June 8. Even though Felix has dedicated his life to serving our country, the regime has charged him and others with a conspiracy to undermine national integrity. The government is alleging that Felix and others were part of a global conspiracy to use foreign resources, including from the US Agency of International Development, the International Republican Institute, and the National Endowment for Democracy, to harm the interests of the nation. We know that some have been subject to psychological torture. Many have lost substantial weight. Felix and Juan Sebastián have each lost 25 pounds in just 3 months. And we worry especially for the women who have been detained, as we have heard that they have been held in solitary confinement for 3 months. And we worry for the children of all the political prisoners who are living without their parents and suffering from trauma and separation anxiety, like my own 8-year-old daughter. But while I'm here, there are more than 140 families suffering the same pain of having a loved one detained or disappear. All Nicaraguan people live in fear from this regime that has shown it will do anything to silence opposition and stay in power. And thousands continue to suffer and die from the regime's neglected and mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic. Chairman Sears, Ranking Member Green, member of this committee, we need the urgent assistance of President Biden and the US Congress to work bilaterally and multilaterally to hold Ortega accountable for this assault on our democracy. I implore you to ensure that the United States work with its allies around the world to defend our human rights. We need your support and action now more than ever.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, and I look forward for your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now recognize President Chinchilla for 5 minutes and her testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman Sears, Ranking Member Green, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation. Nicaragua is at the edge of a precipice with no return. We are only 6 weeks away from the likely consolidation of a ruthless, corrupt, dynastic dictatorship in the heart of the Americas. It will occur despite the multiple resolutions approved by the United Nations Human Rights Council and the General Assembly and Permanent Council of the OAS. Beyond the suffering of the Nicaraguan people, and we just have this testimony, this dismal situation will have a destabilizing impact for the rest of the Central America and the entire hemisphere. Some of the consequences are, first, an increase in forced migration. More than 100,000 Nicaraguans have migrated since April 2018, when the last wave of political repression started. Over 80% of this migration has gone to Costa Rica, my country. However, these flows are turning to the United States of America. It is expected that in 2021, at least 60,000 Nicaraguans will be apprehended at the United States-Mexico border. Second, a disruption in regional trade, a deeper crisis in Nicaragua will hinder the economic reactivation urgently needed by neighboring countries, given that the economies of Central America are highly integrated. Third, an invigoration of undemocratic ruling, Ortega's re-election in a rigged process, particularly after openly defying calls from the international community to correct course, will incentivize other autocratic rulers in Central America and beyond to abandon even the semblance of democracy. Finally, a threat to regional security. Ortega's military strategy of increasing cooperation with Russia risks altering the reasonable balance of forces in Central America. Nicaragua's territory is also being used to protect Central America fugitives from justice, something which is likely to increase. To face these major challenges and risks, I respectfully recommend, number one, to request relevant national and international organizations, including the OAS, to issue updated and reliable reports as soon as possible, documenting the human rights violations and exposing the electoral farce of the regime. Number two, to work towards invocation of Article 21 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter to suspend Nicaragua from the exercise of its right to participate in the OAS. Number three, to align actions of international financial institutions to the findings and recommendations of regional organizations on human rights and democracy in order to stop immediately the external supply of financial oxygen to the Ortega regime. Number four, to eliminate all the support to the Nicaraguan army, a key player in the endurance of the regime, including the support via the U.S. Southern Command. Number five, to investigate Ortega's, Murillo's, families, associates, and businesses for money laundering and drug trafficking, giving prior sanctions on Ortega's son for this kind of crimes. Number six, to increase humanitarian aid for Nicaraguans in exile and for countries receiving immigrants, especially Costa Rica and Panama, including COVID-19 vaccine relief. And finally, to urgently articulate a more coherent, consistent diplomatic offensive with allies in the Western Hemisphere and in the rest of the world to avoid the electoral fraud, or, failing that, to deny the legitimacy to the government resulting from it. Ortega must pay a heavy price for installing a North Korean-style regime in our region. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, democracy in Nicaragua is perishing in broad daylight. It is dying as the hemisphere commemorates 20 years of the declaration of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. Unless this is stopped, it would call into question the effectiveness of our regional instruments and commitments to protect and defend democracy. Action is needed, and it is urgent now. I deeply hope that our next steps will live up to our commitments with democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, President Chinchilla. We will now hear from Dr. Berg for his testimony.
Chairman Cires, Ranking Member Green, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this important topic. Vamos con todo. Let's go with everything. The chilling words of Vice President and First Lady Rosario Murillo ordering spontaneous protests that began in April 2018 to be crushed presaged the brutal consolidation of a dynastic dictatorship in the middle of the Americas. What should have been notable celebrations, the recent 200th anniversary of Central America's Independence Act and the 20th anniversary of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, were instead marred and overshadowed by the depths of despair wrought by this regime, which has declined through all forms of regime hybridity and is now an undisputed dictatorship. To your point about nomenclature, Representative Green and Representative Vargas, no normal regime possesses nearly unlimited executive influence over a country's institutions. No normal regime commits crimes against humanity. No normal regime imprisons and brutally disappears every declared political opponent. No normal regime crosses into the territory of foreign countries to assassinate political opponents in exile. I could go on. November's elections, far from an exercise in democracy, are instead a bitter reaffirmation of the Ortega Murillo family's plan to consolidate a dynastic dictatorship to replace the one that they overthrew. Ortega and his collaborators have set the stage for a coronation ceremony. The regime's latest absurdity is notable because it is so indicative of its nature. The regime issued an arrest warrant for Sergio Ramirez, one of the country's most celebrated authors and Ortega's former vice president. Ramirez's most recent book is set in a country whose people are terrorized by a purported revolutionary government that has long since abandoned whatever principles may have once animated it, and is now concerned with maintaining power at any price. Ramirez's real crime appears to have been dropping his normal genre of fiction, engaging in nonfiction. Old, frightened, paranoid, and thus erratic, the Ortega Murillo regime will stop at nothing in its quest to consolidate power and ensure its survival. And it is my firm belief that they have yet to show their entire hand. The U.S. must lead a strategy of sustained pressure as the cement dries on Nicaragua's consolidated dictatorship. This involves specific policies in the short, medium, and long term. In the short term, we must urgently cut off Ortega's sources of finance. While Congress has dithered, Nicaraguans have been arrested, disappeared, and tortured. Yet the U.S. government has stood by despite valuable laws that could be implemented to a fuller extent. Most importantly, the U.S. must tighten up the interpretation of the NICA Act, which is critical to cutting off Ortega's ability to access funds at multilateral institutions. Ortega now sits on billions of dollars in reserves, which to my understanding is one of the strongest positions he has ever held throughout this crisis. Second, we must advocate for political prisoners. The U.S. should push incessantly for the release of political prisoners in Nicaragua, push for better conditions and legal representation, signs of life for those who have been disappeared. Crucially, it should not reward the regime's hostage-taking strategy, and it should resist at all costs the siren song of negotiations. In the medium term, I think we should ignore entirely November 7th, 2021. The elections are not an exercise in democracy, as I said, and the U.S. should no longer consider this date a meaningful reference point for any of its policymaking. The Ortega Murillo regime has strangled the electoral route, and the U.S. government's theory of political transition must change accordingly. As well as November 7th, I think we need to declare Nicaragua's elections illegitimate under current conditions. The U.S. should be entirely clear about the illegitimacy of these elections and the regime that it affirms, and it should work with partners like Canada, the European Union, and the rest of the countries in Latin America, and encourage them to follow suit. Others have mentioned some of my other policy recommendations, such as Article 21 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, as well as specific sanctions targets that we might go after. I want to mention in the remaining time that I have, CAFTA-DR. The U.S. must review its trading relationship with Nicaragua, and not only is trade with the U.S. a privilege and not a right, but a country lacking even the semblance of the rule of law, like Nicaragua, it is doubtful that it can comply with its obligations under CAFTA-DR. A review of Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA-DR should include a robust discussion all the way up to its potential suspension. Lastly, I want to recommend to the Congress the support and appointment of a time-limited U.S. Special Envoy. Quite simply, at the present moment, U.S. policy is unmoored from a strategy of long-term, consistent pressure on the Ortega Murillo regime. Recent weeks have witnessed the U.S. increase sugar quotas for Nicaragua, and the U.S. Commercial Service organize a trade mission to Managua. Such policies are entirely inconsistent with a policy of pressure on the regime, and a special envoy would be there to direct interagency coordination and develop the necessary international coalition to pressure the regime. I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you again.
Dr. Berg, thank you for your testimony. President Chinchilla, I am concerned about Costa Rica. I am concerned about the influx of Nicaraguans, obviously, leaving Nicaragua. I wonder if you have any suggestion how we can corral some of these members in the area with your experience as a former president to put pressure on Nicaragua to stop doing what they're doing. How do we accomplish that?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for being concerned about Costa Rica. And you are right, because as I mentioned, Nicaragua is a factor of this stabilization in a region which is going through probably the worst time since the civil wars. The Central American nations are going through many difficult problems. So we have to do something about Nicaragua. Now, in the case of Costa Rica, I just want to take the opportunity to call your attention on the need to add some additional humanitarian aid so we can be able to respond to all the Nicaraguans that are fleeing to Costa Rica. Now, concerning the rest of the Central American countries, unfortunately, and this is very sad, I have to recognize that many of the governments are dragging their feet concerning the situation in Nicaragua for many different reasons. There is one government which is about to finish, and his president is just thinking about where to go after that. There is another president who is following a very concerning authoritarian path. So in a certain way, he doesn't want to get involved in these discussions. And there are other governments. We are going through many difficult problems. We can ignore the situation related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the hurricanes that they suffered some years ago. But of course, it is necessary to do something. Let me tell you that one of those institutions that have been lending money to the Nicaraguan government is the Central American Development Bank, and also the Taiwanese government. So I think that the United States, and you are working in a bipartisan kind of way, you have the possibility to approach to those governments, to call their attention, and to try to mobilize a stronger pressure inside those financial institutions, and of course, to keep their commitment at the OAS.
Thank you, President Chinchilla. Dr. Berg, you stated that Nicaragua has millions and millions of dollars in reserve. Where'd that money come from?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. And I share your frustration expressed in the first panel about our inability to leverage to the fullest extent the NICA Act. Much of it has come from multilateral financial institutions that have lent Nicaragua money for a number of reasons. Some of it has been pandemic related. Other of it has been special drawing rights, as has been mentioned by the Deputy Assistant Secretary. So it's been for a number of reasons. But by my calculation and what is actually publicly available data, the Nicaraguan regime is currently sitting in the billions of dollars in terms of their reserves. We talked earlier in this hearing about the little amount of money that has been used on the COVID-19 response in Nicaragua. And Carlos Fernando Chamorro of Confidencial had a very nice report on September 1st of this year, where he basically said that only 10% of the funds that had been given by multilateral banks and had been pegged for the COVID-19 response had actually been used in the Nicaraguan Ministry of Health. So there's a lot of money out there, as we've been hinting at throughout this hearing, that's being used for other purposes, where it's padding the ruling couple's personal bank accounts and their crony networks. It's completely non-transparent where that money actually is. And so Confidencial says about 10% of that funding. That's very concerning from my perspective.
How do we bring attention to the IMF, all these things that you just said to me?
Congressman, I think in the Renacer Act, if I'm not mistaken, there is an explicit calling for a ramping up of the NICA Act, using the NICA Act to the fullest extent that it can possibly be used. And it's my understanding that if we were to implement the NICA Act to its fullest extent, we have the tools available to call out the IMF. We have the tools available to use our influence at that institution to make sure that these kinds of loans don't keep the regime afloat. So I think we have everything that we need. We just need to start using, in some cases, the tools that we have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Valle, what is the condition of your husband today?
Yes, the only information that we have was the one that we get from her sister during this 20-minute visit. And what she told us is that he looks very skinny, around, I already mentioned, around, we calculate that he had lost around 25 pounds. And he also mentioned about these continued interrogations, sometimes 3 times a day, every day. They cannot go outside to receive light from the sun. I mean, you can tell in their aspect that they are not being fed well. And we truly believe that their lives are in danger. We are afraid of them dying. And I only mention this because of my husband and my own feeling, but also we have learned that some of the political prisoners have lost more than 25 pounds, and because of their age, they have to receive special treatment and medical assistance, which we know they are not getting. And we also heard from others that the police is asking for another type of medication, which they didn't drink before getting into prison. So we can know that their health is deteriorating very fast. And I mean, the situation is just horrible, and they are incomunicados right now. After that meeting, we haven't heard from them again. We haven't seen them again. So they just give us that 20 minutes to talk to them under surveillance, because the police was present there. They have cameras recording the families when they enter. And we know they even have audio recording while they were talking. So there were not like a space where they can have privacy to really say everything. So we are afraid of their well-being and about their lives. And we are asking the regime to let us know, and to let us get in touch with them, to let us bring them food, because they're not being fed well. We are asking and demanding, because it's a right to have visits, as the law says. And even imagine.
My time is up. I need to move on to a ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Dr. Berg. And are there any foreign governments with interest in Nicaragua that are undermining U.S. and international efforts there? And if there are, could you describe both in terms of their direct involvement with the government as well as through multinational organizations? I'm specifically talking about other countries.
Thank you, Congressman Green, for the question. Yes, the 2 countries that I would point out as extra-hemispheric actors who have come into the hemisphere to shore up the the Ortega regime are Russia and Iran. Russia, we've seen with a significant presence in Nicaragua for a while. It's increased its presence in past years to an extent that I think should be very alarming for the U.S. government. Not only does it have a number of port agreements with Nicaragua and access to the Caribbean, where it can engage in anti-access and area denial capabilities potentially, but also in cyberspace. We saw recently the Russians and the Nicaraguans sign a major agreement in the cyberspace, particularly to help the regime not only increase its domestic security apparatus, but to spy potentially on the opposition, on Nicaraguan citizens, and indeed potentially on other governments in Central America, depending upon the strength of the equipment transfers that we'll see in future. So they have a whole number or whole range of capabilities that they are developing within Nicaragua. There are signals intelligence stations that are actually quite close to the U.S. Embassy in Managua. And so that's Russia. Russia has an interest in shoring up this regime on the cheap. And I think Iran has approached the regime in a number of ways, most specifically in offering partnerships to circumvent U.S. sanctions architecture, at which it excels because of the sanctions architecture that it has been under for so long. And we haven't seen as deep, I would say, as a presence of the Iranians in Nicaragua, but it's there and it's also concerning. I think in general, Congressman, part of the Ortega regime's plan for survival is to sort of recreate a situation of rivalry and enmity in Central America again, and lend a platform for major geopolitical competitors to the United States to increase their capabilities on the U.S. doorstep. And I think that's a significant aspect of this political, economic, and social crisis that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, he very clearly sees that as sustaining him against any efforts that we might make. The concern for us, of course, is that it puts those authoritarians right there. And it brings up my next question for President Chinchilla. Ma'am, what are your thoughts on Ortega himself exporting this authoritarianism throughout Central and all of Latin America? Do you feel like he's having an impact? We know Maduro is, but what is Ortega's impact throughout the region with the influence and power of authoritarian government?
He is coordinating actions with Venezuela and Cuba. And from that point of view, his influence is expanding, of course. Now, let me give you some examples of what has happened in Costa Rica. He, for example, sent someone about 2 weeks ago to menace some of the people living there. Even one person was hit by with a gun by some persons that are related to the Nicaraguan security forces. Secondly, they are trying to destabilize through the use of social media some of the nations around them. And finally, he was even able to invade Costa Rica when I was in government, because I may remember you that Costa Rica has no army. We have relied on basically our diplomacy and international law to defend ourselves. So he also profits from this kind of specific conditions that we have. But certainly, if we allow Ortega to stay in power for more years, he will continue adding his efforts along with Cuba and Venezuela to destabilize our region.
Thank you, and Chairman, I yield.
We now recognize Congressman Vargas for 5 minutes.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and I want to thank all three of our witnesses, Ms. Valle, President Chinchilla, and of course, Dr. Berg. When we hear about these dictators, and there's a number of them around the world, we always hear the same thing. These are horrible people, and they are. And that we should do something about it and get rid of them. But they seem to be very resilient. I mean, we do a whole lot of things to try to get rid of them, and we're not very successful. I'll just be frank. I mean, I know that someone will come after me and chant and rant against Cuba and Castro, but he's been there a long time. I mean, we wanted to get rid of him for a long time. We've done lots of things to try to get rid of him, but we can't get rid of him. I mean, we of course, Maduro is destroying his country, and Venezuela is just absolute destruction of that poor country, which used to be a wealthy country, and there's not much we can do. And now we have, Daniel Ortega destroying his country, absolutely destroying it. And everybody comes and says, you got to do something about it, you got to do something about it. And, the United States is not doing anything. Well, the truth is that these guys seem to be pretty damn resilient. Dr. Berg, what is it about these autocratic, dictatorial people that they're so damn resilient?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I share your sentiment that autocratic and dictatorial regimes are unfortunately quite resilient. They do rely, I think, on what I would call a dictator's playbook, a well-worn playbook that many of them follow, and therefore it is exportable, to Congressman Green's earlier question, for others to follow and for others to mimic and to copy. I think there are well-worn steps along the way. And of course, it would have been nice if the U.S. government had acted sooner against Ortega. But we're here in this moment now. And so we're urging,
If I could interrupt you, acted sooner how? By doing what? I mean, that's, I think, the whole point. I mean, I think people think we have a magic bullet. If the United States had done this, well, we did a whole lot of damn things against all these guys, and they still seem to survive. That's the point.
Well, Congressman, so right now we heard from the Deputy Assistant Secretary that we're going to condemn and express concern. I think those are important things to do, but I think that this regime doesn't necessarily understand them in the same way that you and I do, and I would urge further. Look, we've had the NICA Act since 2018. You asked what we can do. That's just a simple example. We've had the NICA Act since 2018, and we haven't been using it to the fullest extent since 2018. That's 3 years of significant amounts of funding that has gone to the Ortega regime. This is one of the regime's main sources of reserves. There is not a robust government, there is not a robust economy, rather, in Nicaragua. It's been noted in this hearing. Nicaragua is either the second or the third poorest country in the hemisphere, depending upon how you measure it. So we have tools. They're not silver bullets, like you said. They're not magic wands. And I agree that the regime's dictatorial regimes are resilient. But we have tools.
Well, but it seems to me that even when we use these tools, oftentimes we impoverish the people there, but the regime stays the same. I mean, look at Maduro. I mean, Maduro has destroyed that country. That was a wealthy country. We've done all sorts of things, and we've impoverished the people there, and they've gone all over the damn place. But we haven't gotten him out of there. He's still there. And again, I think we've done a lot to try to get rid of him. But he's resilient. These guys are resilient. I don't think they give a crap about their people. I think they give a crap about themselves. And so they don't care if the people suffer as long as they're in power.
Well, Nicaragua has been running a very poor and impoverished state for a long time. Ortega, rather, has been presiding over a very poor and impoverished state for a long time. He's been in power this go-around since 2007. And so it's not just recently that Nicaragua has descended to either the second or third poorest country in the hemisphere. For many years, there's been a crony capitalist system there in Nicaragua, and it hasn't been working for the general Nicaraguan. And so the conversation is well overdue for Nicaraguans to have this conversation among themselves about what makes for the best country. They tried to do that this year. All of their candidates were arrested.
Dr. Berg, I think that President Chinchilla wanted to answer that. Go ahead, President.
Thank you so much. No, I just want to mention that, in my opinion, we still have some additional instruments in order to protect democracy in our hemisphere. Because basically the instruments that we designed were prepared for the kind of abrupt disruption of constitutional order. But we are not prepared for this new kind of gradual deterioration of democracy. And basically, I will suggest, for example, to introduce democratic clauses on some important regional instruments. So the financial institutions and, for example, the trade agreements can really be suspended when those democratic clauses are not complied. We need to put teeth to the instruments.
Madam President, thank you. My time has expired, but I appreciate both of your answers very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. Again, thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. As the Ortega regime moves ahead with stealing this November's elections, the international community must come together to impose a very steep price. I believe we should work urgently with our allies in Latin America and Europe between now and November 7th, to lay out clear consequences for Ortega if he continues down this current path. We need to demonstrate that we stand on the side of democracy in full support of the Nicaraguan people